Leon Carter never imagined that a single sentence, spoken only to avoid trouble, would end up rewriting the entire direction of his life. It happened during a routine business trip for Westbridge Industries, in a crowded airport terminal, where dozens of curious eyes lingered a little too long on the two of them walking side by side. Olivia Bennett, the company's chief executive, moved close to him without a trace of hesitation, completely unaware of how the moment looked to everyone watching. Leon, ever careful, ever conscious of appearances, leaned slightly toward her and murmured a quiet warning. The kind of thing a loyal employee says to protect his boss from gossip. He told her that people might start thinking they were together. He meant it as caution. She turned it into something else entirely. Olivia stopped walking. She looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time in longer than anyone at Westbridge could remember, something like amusement flickered across her famously composed face. "Would that be such a terrible thing?" she asked him, her voice calm, almost teasing, carrying just enough weight to make the hallway around them fall completely silent. Leon felt his chest tighten. He had no answer ready, because nothing in his carefully guarded life had prepared him for a woman like Olivia Bennett to say something so disarmingly honest in front of an audience. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that the most powerful woman in the company had been quietly in love with him for a very long time. Leon Carter was 39 years old, a man whose reputation had been built brick by brick through years of quiet competence rather than charm. He had been divorced for 5 years, and though his past held the memory of once being a devoted father, that chapter of his life remained just that, a memory carried privately, never spoken of at the office, never allowed to interfere with the professional armor he wore every single day. At Westbridge, he served as Technical Operations Manager, a title that undersold just how essential he had become to the company's survival during moments of crisis. Engineers respected him. Executives trusted him, and everyone, without exception, agreed on one thing. Leon Carter never flattered anyone, never postured for attention, and always let his results speak louder than his words ever could. He was known throughout the building for his calm under pressure. The way he could walk into a collapsing situation, a server failure, a supply chain disaster, a client threatening to walk, and somehow leave the room 20 minutes later with a plan that actually worked. He did not raise his voice. He did not seek credit. He simply solved problems, one after another, year after year, until his name became shorthand for reliability itself. Colleagues joked that if the building caught fire, Leon would already be halfway through evacuating everyone before the alarm even finished its first ring. Underneath that composure, though, was a man who had built high walls around his heart, walls constructed from disappointment, from a marriage that had ended in exhaustion rather than hatred, from a quiet decision made years earlier that love was simply not worth the risk anymore. There had been a version of Leon, once, who believed deeply in the kind of life most people dreamed about. A steady marriage, a home filled with warmth, a future built patiently year after year with someone who trusted him completely. For a while, he had lived inside that dream, waking early to make breakfast before work, staying up late, helping with homework, showing up to every recital and every parent evening with the quiet devotion of a man who considered fatherhood the most important role he would ever hold. That chapter of his life had closed years earlier. And though he rarely spoke of it, the discipline and patience it had taught him never left him. Resurfacing instead in the careful, steady way he led his teams and solved problems that would have overwhelmed almost anyone else in the building. Younger engineers who joined the company sometimes assumed Leon's composure meant he lacked emotion altogether, that a man so unshakable in a crisis must simply be wired differently than everyone else. Those who worked closely with him over the years knew better. They saw the way his jaw tightened during particularly difficult calls, the way he occasionally stayed at his desk long after everyone else had gone home. Not because the work demanded it, but because silence at home had, for a long time, felt heavier than silence at the office. Nobody pried. Nobody asked. And Leon, true to form, never offered an explanation, choosing instead to let his work speak for a version of himself he rarely allowed anyone to see. Olivia Bennett was 36 years old, and she carried the distinction of being the youngest chief executive in the company's long history, a fact that both impressed and unsettled the older generation of board members who had never quite gotten used to taking orders from someone they once considered too young for the role. She was known for being cold, distant, rarely seen smiling in meetings, and utterly allergic to flattery of any kind. Executives who tried to charm their way into her favor learned quickly that Olivia rewarded substance, not smiles. The general consensus among employees was simple and unanimous. Olivia Bennett cared about nothing except the company, its numbers, its future, its survival in a brutal marketplace. Nobody suspected there was anything more beneath that icy exterior. She had earned the position the hard way, climbing through finance and strategy divisions long before anyone imagined a woman her age might eventually run the entire company. There had been resistance at every step, whispered doubts about her readiness, quiet bets among senior staff about how quickly she would fail once given real authority. Olivia answered every doubt the same way, not with speeches or arguments, but with results that made the doubts impossible to sustain. Within 2 years of taking the top position, she had restructured 3 failing divisions, renegotiated critical supplier contracts, and pulled the company back from the edge of a financial crisis that had nearly cost thousands of employees their jobs. The same board members who once questioned her capability now quietly credited her with saving the company entirely, even if few of them ever said so to her face. What almost nobody understood about Olivia was how lonely that climb had been. She had learned early that warmth read as weakness in rooms full of men twice her age, who were waiting for any excuse to dismiss her, and so she had trained herself, deliberately and painfully, to keep her expressions guarded, her voice level, her decisions unclouded by anything resembling sentiment. It had worked. It had also cost her something she rarely allowed herself to examine too closely, a kind of isolation that came from being respected by everyone and truly known by almost no one. What none of them knew, what nobody in that building had the slightest idea about, was that Olivia had spent 3 years quietly watching Leon Carter, observing him not with the detached interest of a boss evaluating an employee, but with something far more personal, something she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge, even in her own private thoughts. She noticed the way he handled failure without blaming his team. She noticed the way he stayed late without ever mentioning it to anyone, the way he turned down credit that rightfully belonged to him and redirected it toward the people who had actually done the work alongside him. She told herself, for a long time, that this was simply professional admiration. Then, one afternoon, the company announced that both of them would be leading a delegation overseas to finalize a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And everything quietly began to shift. The airport that morning was crowded, loud, and full of the particular tension that accompanies high-stakes business travel. Executives checking phones, assistants juggling boarding passes, a small army of Westbridge employees trailing behind their 2 leaders like a current following a river. Olivia and Leon had spent the walk through the terminal, discussing final details of the contract, numbers and clauses, and contingency plans. Their conversation entirely professional, entirely focused, but somewhere along the way, without either of them fully noticing, the physical distance between them had shrunk. She walked close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed. He found himself unconsciously matching her pace instead of trailing slightly behind, the way protocol usually demanded. Behind them, the murmurs started small, barely audible whispers among the junior staff who noticed things their superiors often missed. A glance exchanged. A laugh that lingered a beat too long. Leon, ever attuned to how situations could spiral out of control, felt the shift in the air behind him and made the decision to address it directly, quietly, before it became something neither of them could contain. He leaned toward her, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear, and told her to be careful, because people were going to start thinking they were a couple. It was meant as protection, an act of loyalty disguised as caution, the kind of warning a devoted employee gives to shield his boss from unnecessary scrutiny. Olivia stopped walking entirely. The staff behind them nearly collided into each other, trying to avoid bumping into their suddenly motionless CEO. She turned to face Leon fully, her expression unreadable for one long second before it softened into something almost playful, something none of her employees had ever witnessed on her face in 3 years of working under her leadership. "Would that be such a bad thing?" she asked, her voice steady, deliberate, carrying none of the panic or embarrassment Leon had expected. For a moment, Leon simply stood there, stunned into silence, because this was the first time in his entire career at Westbridge that Olivia Bennet had said anything resembling flirtation, and he had absolutely no framework for processing it. The staff behind them exchanged glances loaded with unspoken questions. Somebody discreetly lifted a phone. Nobody said a word out loud, but everybody understood, in that instant, that something had shifted between their two leaders, something too significant to ignore and too delicate to discuss openly. By the time the delegation boarded the plane, the story had already begun traveling through group chats and hallway conversations back at headquarters, growing slightly with each retelling, the way rumors always do when left unattended. Leon spent the entire flight staring out the window, replaying Olivia's question in his mind, unable to decide whether he had imagined the warmth in her voice or whether something real had actually happened in that terminal. Within days, what had started as a handful of whispered observations exploded into something far larger and far more public than either of them could have anticipated. The company's internal messaging boards lit up with speculation. Anonymous posts appeared on employee forums, some playful, some pointed, all of them fixated on the same question everyone seemed desperate to answer. Screenshots and half-true details found their way onto professional networking sites, where strangers who had never met either of them began constructing entire narratives out of nothing more than a photograph taken at the airport. Then the actual press picked it up. Business publications that normally covered quarterly earnings, suddenly running headlines asking whether the CEO of Westbridge Industries was romantically involved with a subordinate. The photographs were unremarkable on their own, simply two people walking closely together through a terminal. But paired with speculative captions and breathless commentary, they became something else entirely, evidence in the court of public opinion for a scandal that had not actually happened yet. Board members who had spent years respecting Olivia's leadership suddenly found themselves fielding uncomfortable questions from shareholders concerned about optics, about governance, about whether their young, brilliant CEO had compromised her judgment for personal reasons. Some board members argued privately that Olivia's carefully built reputation, the image of a disciplined, unemotional executive who put the company above everything else, was unraveling in real time, and that unraveling threatened investor confidence at a moment when the company could least afford it. Analysts who covered the industry began weighing in as well, publishing commentary that had nothing to do with the actual contract Westbridge had just secured overseas and everything to do with speculation about the private life of its chief executive. A few pieces attempted balance, noting that Olivia's professional record spoke for itself and deserved more weight than a handful of photographs. Most did not bother with such nuance, finding it far easier and far more profitable to lean into the drama of a powerful woman, supposedly losing her composure over a subordinate. Within the company itself, the mood shifted noticeably, conversations quieting the moment Olivia or Leon entered a room, replaced by the particular silence of people who had been talking about someone just seconds earlier. Leon's own team noticed the change first, the way visiting executives from other departments suddenly found reasons to walk past his desk, glancing at him with a curiosity that had nothing to do with his work. A few colleagues offered supportive words in private, reminding him that his record spoke for itself. But even their support carried an undertone of concern, as though they were bracing themselves for a fall they feared might be coming. Leon absorbed all of it quietly, the way he absorbed every crisis, refusing to let his composure crack in public even as the pressure mounted with each passing day. Leon watched the storm build from a distance, feeling a familiar dread settle into his stomach, the same dread he remembered from years earlier when his marriage had begun collapsing under the weight of suspicion and misunderstanding. He requested a private meeting with Olivia, walking into her office with a proposal already formed in his mind. An offer to transfer to a different department entirely, to remove himself from her orbit before the situation caused any real damage to her career or the company's standing. He explained his reasoning calmly, methodically, the way he approached every problem, framing it as the logical solution to an illogical situation that had spiraled beyond either of their control. Olivia listened to his entire proposal without interrupting, her hands folded on the desk in front of her, her expression giving away nothing until he finally finished speaking. Then she asked him a single question that stopped him cold, a question that seemed to hang in the air between them far longer than its handful of words should have allowed. Why, she asked, was he always the one expected to disappear? Why was it always assumed that he should be the one to step back, to sacrifice his position, to shrink himself smaller so that other people could feel comfortable? Leon opened his mouth to respond and found that he had nothing to say, because underneath her question was a truth he had never actually examined about himself. The silence between them stretched long enough that it became its own kind of answer, and Leon left her office that afternoon carrying a question he could not shake, one that would follow him home and sit with him through a sleepless night. Somewhere beneath his professional caution, beneath the careful walls he had built around every part of his life that involved vulnerability, was an old wound he had never fully addressed, a wound that had convinced him, years earlier, that love always came with a price too steep to pay. That night, alone in his apartment, memories he had spent years avoiding rose to the surface, with an intensity he could no longer outrun. His marriage had ended 5 years earlier, not in a single dramatic explosion, but in a slow accumulation of suspicion and exhaustion that eventually became unbearable for both people involved. His former wife had grown convinced, somewhere along the way, that his long hours at work meant something more sinister than simple dedication to his job. She questioned his phone, his schedule, his every interaction with female colleagues, until every conversation between them became an interrogation disguised as concern. Leon had tried, for a long time, to reassure her, to prove his loyalty through patience and honesty, but eventually he realized that no amount of proof would ever satisfy suspicion once it had taken root that deeply. The marriage ended quietly, without cruelty, but with a finality that left him hollowed out in ways he rarely admitted even to himself. The hardest part had never been the arguments themselves, but the slow erosion of trust that preceded them, the way small doubts compounded night after night, until neither of them could remember what it felt like to simply believe each other. Leon remembered coming home from a 16-hour shift during a system outage, exhausted beyond words, only to be met with questions about where he had really been, questions no explanation seemed capable of satisfying. He remembered the particular loneliness of being suspected for doing exactly what he had always done, working hard, staying loyal, showing up for people who needed him, and having none of it be enough. By the time the divorce was finalized, he had stopped trying to defend himself altogether. Choosing silence over an exhausting argument he no longer believed he could win. After the divorce, Leon made a private vow that he repeated to himself so often it became a kind of internal law. He would never again allow himself to fall for a colleague. He would never let his professional life intersect with his romantic one, never place himself in a position where whispers and assumptions could once again dismantle something he cared about. It was not that he had stopped believing in love entirely, but rather that he had convinced himself the risk was simply not worth the inevitable cost, that some men were better off keeping their hearts locked safely away from the kind of scrutiny his job and his history seemed to invite. For 5 years, that vow had held firm, uncontested, until a woman named Olivia Bennett walked into his life and quietly began dismantling it without ever raising her voice. What made Olivia different, what Leon slowly began to notice in the weeks following that airport moment, was how carefully she handled his hesitation. She never pushed. She never demanded an explanation for his caution, or pressed him to explain the walls he so obviously carried. Instead, she simply remained present, steady, patient, showing up in small, unremarkable ways that gradually chipped away at his defenses without ever announcing themselves as an attack. She would leave a coffee on his desk during a long night of troubleshooting a system failure, never mentioning it, never expecting acknowledgement. She would ask about his weekend with genuine curiosity rather than obligatory politeness. Slowly, without either of them naming it directly, something had begun growing between them, something patient and real, built not on grand gestures but on quiet consistency. Anyone watching closely enough, and by this point plenty of people were watching closely, could see that whatever existed between Olivia and Leon carried none of the recklessness the rumors implied. It looked, instead, like something far rarer, a kind of maturity in how two guarded people were learning to trust each other without demanding anything in return. Olivia never used her position to pressure him. Leon never used the situation to seek advantage. Their connection, still unspoken, still unofficial, was built on the same qualities that had made each of them respected long before rumors ever entered the picture: patience, restraint, and a quiet, stubborn kind of integrity that refused to be rushed. The peace did not last long. A rival firm, one that had been competing bitterly against Westbridge for the same overseas contract, saw an opportunity in the swirling gossip and decided to weaponize it. Anonymous sources began feeding stories to journalists, carefully worded accusations suggesting that Leon's recent involvement in high-level negotiations had less to do with his skill and far more to do with personal favoritism from the chief executive herself. The narrative spread quickly because it was exactly the kind of story people wanted to believe. A tidy explanation for a talented man's success that reduced years of hard-earned expertise into something scandalous and small. Business publications ran headlines questioning whether Westbridge had prioritized relationships over competence, framing Leon not as the skilled operations manager who had saved the company from disaster more than once, but as a beneficiary of favoritism riding the coattails of a powerful woman's affection. The accusations stung in a way Leon had not expected, not because they threatened his career, though they certainly did, but because they erased every ounce of effort he had poured into his work over the years, reducing his entire professional identity to a punchline about proximity to power. The board of directors, already nervous from the earlier wave of speculation, demanded a formal internal investigation into the nature of Leon's promotions and his working relationship with the chief executive. Leon made his decision quickly, the same way he approached every crisis, methodically and without hesitation. Walking into Olivia's office to offer his resignation before the investigation could even formally begin, he told her it was the only way to protect both her reputation and the company's stability, that stepping away voluntarily would remove any question of impropriety and allow the business to move forward without further distraction. He expected her to accept the offer with the same measured professionalism she brought to every decision. Instead, for the first time since he had known her, Olivia Bennett looked genuinely angry. She refused his resignation outright, her voice sharp enough that it startled even him, a man who thought he had witnessed every version of her professional demeanor. She told him plainly that she would not allow years of proven excellence to be dismissed because of gossip manufactured by a competitor desperate for an advantage they could not earn honestly. When the formal board meeting convened to discuss the investigation, Olivia stood before the entire room of skeptical directors and shareholders, and rather than defending herself or offering apologies for the situation, she challenged them directly. If they wanted to investigate something, she told them, they should investigate Leon's actual track record first. Every project he had rescued, every crisis he had resolved, every dollar his work had saved the company over the years. Nobody in that room found the courage to respond. The silence that followed her challenge told its own story. A room full of powerful people suddenly unwilling to argue with facts they knew they could not dispute. The investigation continued on paper, a formality required by corporate governance, but its momentum had visibly shifted the moment Olivia refused to let the narrative go unanswered. Word of what had happened in that boardroom spread through the company almost as quickly as the original rumors had, and for the first time since the scandal began, the tide of opinion inside Westbridge began quietly turning back in Leon's favor. Employees who had privately doubted him began recalling, out loud this time, all the moments he had personally saved their projects, their deadlines, their jobs. The rival firm behind the leaked story had underestimated one crucial detail in their calculations: the sheer volume of goodwill Leon had built over a decade of quiet, unglamorous reliability. Within days, current and former colleagues began speaking up unprompted, some to journalists, others simply within their own professional circles, recounting specific instances where Leon had personally intervened to prevent disaster, often without ever seeking recognition for doing so. A junior engineer who had nearly lost her position during an earlier system failure spoke publicly about how Leon had shielded her from blame at his own professional expense, insisting the fault belonged to flawed processes rather than her inexperience. The narrative the competitors had tried so carefully to construct began collapsing under the accumulated weight of testimony nobody had asked for and everybody believed. Then came the crisis that would settle the question for good. A critical failure struck one of the company's primary manufacturing facilities. A technical malfunction so severe that it threatened to derail the very contract the overseas trip had been meant to secure. Engineers warned that without an immediate and complex fix, the company stood to lose the deal entirely, along with the reputation that came with it. Leon took command of the emergency response the moment the alarm went out, coordinating teams across multiple time zones, working through the problem with the same calm precision that had defined his entire career, refusing to leave the building even as exhaustion crept into every corner of his body. For 48 consecutive hours, Leon barely slept, moving between server rooms and emergency meetings, troubleshooting failure after failure alongside a team that trusted him completely because he had earned that trust one crisis at a time over many years. When the system finally stabilized, when the manufacturing line came back online just hours before the client's deadline, the relief that swept through the company was immediate and overwhelming. The client themselves, initially prepared to walk away from the contract entirely, sent word directly to the board praising the technical team's response, stating plainly that, without Leon's leadership during those critical hours, they would have canceled the agreement without a second thought. The failure itself had started small, a single sensor reporting inconsistent data that most engineers would have dismissed as a minor calibration error. Leon, trusting instincts sharpened by years of similar crises, insisted on tracing the problem to its root rather than patching the symptom, and what he found buried 3 layers deep in the system's architecture was a cascading fault that, left unaddressed, would have shut down the entire production line within days. He assembled his team at nearly midnight, walking them through the problem with the same patient clarity he brought to every crisis, refusing to let panic take hold, even as the clock ticked toward a deadline that felt increasingly impossible to meet. Engineers who worked alongside him that weekend would later describe it as the defining memory of their careers at Westbridge, the sight of a man functioning on almost no sleep, who nonetheless remained the calmest person in every room he entered. He delegated without ever losing sight of the larger picture, checked in with junior staff who were clearly struggling under the pressure, and somehow found a way to make even the most exhausted members of his team believe the problem was solvable. When the final system check confirmed the fix had held, a quiet cheer went up across the control room, followed almost immediately by Leon, insisting everyone go home and rest, refusing to let anyone linger to celebrate what he considered simply the completion of the job he was paid to do. That single crisis did more to silence the rumors than any statement or investigation ever could. Board members who had questioned Leon's competence weeks earlier now spoke of him with open admiration, acknowledging, some for the first time, that his success had never depended on anyone's favor, but had been earned through sheer skill and relentless dedication. The narrative the rival firm had tried so hard to construct collapsed under the weight of undeniable results, and slowly, the conversation inside Westbridge shifted away from scandal and back toward respect. The kind of respect Leon had spent his entire career building one difficult night at a time. A few evenings after the crisis had finally settled, Olivia invited Leon to dinner. A quiet, unhurried evening away from the noise of headquarters, away from board members and rumors, and the exhausting scrutiny of the past several weeks. It was the first time either of them had spoken openly, without professional pretense, about what had actually been building between them long before that moment in the airport terminal. Olivia told him, with a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself, that her feelings had not begun with the airport, nor even with the overseas trip, but 3 years earlier, quietly, without either of them realizing it at the time. She admitted it had nothing to do with his appearance or his title. The things most people assumed drew attention in a workplace built on hierarchy and ambition. What had actually caught her attention, she explained, was a moment few people even remembered. an afternoon when a project had failed spectacularly under intense pressure, and Leon had stood in front of senior leadership and taken full responsibility himself, refusing to let a single member of his team absorb blame that belonged, in reality, to circumstances entirely beyond anyone's control. She remembered another moment too, a time he had turned down a substantial bonus, insisting the credit and the reward belonged to the people who had actually done the difficult work alongside him. Those were the moments, she told him quietly, that had first made her heart notice him. What moved her, she said. Sitting across from him in the dim light of that restaurant was never his job title or his position within the company. It was the quiet integrity underneath all of it, the kind of character that never announced itself, never sought recognition, but simply existed consistently, day after day, in the smallest and most unremarkable decisions. Leon sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing words he had never expected to hear from anyone, let alone from a woman he had spent years assuming was unreachable, both because of her position and because of the walls he had built around his own heart. Something inside him, something that had been closed off for half a decade, began to loosen for the first time. Olivia continued, telling him about the quiet decision she had made years earlier to never let herself act on those feelings, certain that doing so would compromise everything she had worked to build, both for the company and for her own sense of professional integrity. She had watched him from a careful distance, telling herself that admiration was allowed even when action was not, convincing herself that the feeling would eventually fade the way most quiet infatuations do. It had not faded. If anything, watching him navigate the recent scandal with the same steady dignity he brought to every crisis had only deepened her certainty that whatever she felt for him was not a passing distraction, but something far more enduring. Leon found himself telling her things he had not spoken aloud in years, about the slow death of his marriage, about the private vow he had made to protect himself from ever feeling that kind of helplessness again, about how her patience over the recent weeks had done more to earn his trust than any grand gesture could have managed. Neither of them rushed the conversation. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden collapse of every wall Leon had spent years constructing. Instead, there was simply an honest, unhurried exchange between two people finally willing to say out loud what they had both been carrying quietly for far too long. In the days that followed, Olivia made a decision that surprised even the executives who thought they understood her best. Rather than continuing to hide the relationship, allowing it to exist in whispers and speculation, she chose to confront the situation directly and publicly. She called a formal press conference, standing before journalists, board members, and employees alike, and stated plainly that her relationship with Leon Carter had only recently begun, that it involved no favoritism whatsoever, and that she intended to prove it through transparent action rather than empty denial. Alongside that announcement, Olivia unveiled a restructured reporting system, one that removed Leon from any direct line of authority beneath her, ensuring that every future decision regarding his role, his compensation, and his advancement would run through an entirely independent process with full board oversight. She implemented broader transparency measures across the company's leadership structure as well, framing the changes not as a concession to the scandal, but as an improvement in governance that Westbridge should have adopted long before controversy ever forced the issue. The press, having built weeks of speculation on ambiguity and hidden motives, suddenly found nothing left to attack. The story, deprived of scandal, quietly lost its momentum. Shareholders, who had spent weeks anxious about optics, expressed satisfaction with the new structure, and the controversy that had once threatened to derail two careers began fading into an old, mostly forgotten headline. Industry observers who had once written critically about Westbridge's governance now pointed to the new structure as a model other companies might consider adopting, an unexpected outcome that transformed what had once looked like a liability into something resembling a competitive advantage. Board members who had privately worried about reputational damage found themselves instead fielding questions from peer companies curious about how Westbridge had managed to turn a potential scandal into a demonstration of institutional integrity. Olivia never took public credit for the shift in perception, insisting instead that the changes had simply been the correct decision regardless of how the press chose to frame them. Not long after the press conference, Leon found himself standing face to face with his former wife for the first time in over a year. A chance encounter neither of them had planned, but one that felt, somehow, exactly like something both of them needed. There was no anger left between them, no lingering resentment. Only the quiet, settled calm of two people who had once hurt each other and had since found their own separate paths toward healing. They spoke briefly, warmly, about nothing important, and when they parted ways, Leon realized something had shifted inside him during that short conversation, something he had not expected to feel after so many years of carrying quiet bitterness. He understood, walking away from that encounter, that he was no longer living inside the wreckage of his old marriage, no longer defined by the suspicion and exhaustion that had once convinced him love was too dangerous a risk to take again. The realization arrived quietly, without fanfare, the way most genuine transformations tend to happen, not through some singular dramatic epiphany, but through the slow accumulation of small moments that eventually added up to something undeniable. In the weeks that followed, people around him began noticing subtle changes, a lightness in his demeanor that had not been there before, a willingness to laugh more freely, to let his guard down in ways that had once felt entirely foreign to him. That evening, Leon called Olivia and asked her to meet him, choosing his words carefully as he prepared to say something he had never imagined himself capable of saying just months earlier. When she arrived, he told her plainly that this time, he had no interest in avoiding the rumors, no desire to hide behind caution or professional distance the way he once had. He was done running from what other people might think, done sacrificing his own happiness to manage other people's assumptions. Olivia laughed. A genuine, unguarded laugh that Leon had rarely heard from her before that moment, and something about the simplicity of that sound told him more clearly than any words could that he had finally made the right decision. A year passed, and Westbridge Industries not only recovered from the turbulence of that scandal, but grew stronger because of the transparency measures born out of it, securing new contracts, rebuilding investor confidence, and establishing a reputation for governance that other companies in the industry began quietly studying and imitating. Leon, through his own merit alone, was promoted to Director of Engineering, a position he earned entirely on the strength of his track record, free from any question of favoritism, thanks to the independent evaluation process Olivia had put in place a year earlier. Nobody inside the company doubted, anymore, that his rise had been anything other than deserved. At the company's annual gala that year, an event filled with executives, investors, and journalists who had once speculated wildly about the nature of his relationship with the chief executive, someone finally worked up the courage to ask him directly whether it felt difficult being romantically involved with someone as powerful as Olivia Bennet. Leon smiled, an easy, confident smile that carried none of the old caution people remembered from years earlier, and told the room simply that he did not love the chief executive. The answer landed with visible confusion among the small crowd gathered around him, murmurs rippling through the room as people tried to make sense of what he had just said. Leon turned, found Olivia standing a few feet away in the soft light of the ballroom, and reached for her hand, holding it firmly, publicly, without a trace of the hesitation that had once defined every interaction between them. He explained, his voice steady and clear enough for everyone nearby to hear, that he loved a woman who had believed in him even when the entire world around them seemed determined to doubt him, a woman whose faith in his character had never wavered even during the darkest weeks of the scandal that had threatened to destroy both their reputations. Olivia looked at him with an expression softer than anyone in that room had ever witnessed on her face, and answered that she, in turn, loved a man who had never once used their relationship to seek advantage for himself, a man whose integrity had remained untouched by opportunity, even when opportunity had been readily available to him. The room, filled with people who had spent months speculating, judging, and doubting the two of them, rose together in spontaneous applause, the kind of reaction that surprises even the people receiving it. Leon and Olivia left the gala together that night, walking out through the same kind of crowd that had once whispered behind their backs, except this time there was nothing left to whisper about, no rumor left to chase, no scandal left to manufacture. They walked side by side, without hesitation, without the careful distance Leon had once insisted upon in an airport terminal a year earlier. Two people who had weathered gossip, betrayal, and their own private fears to arrive at something neither of them had expected to find again. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet, a sharp contrast to the noise and light they had just left behind. Olivia laughed softly, remembering aloud how strange it felt to think back on the version of herself who had once believed she needed to hide every ounce of warmth in order to be taken seriously. Leon squeezed her hand and told her that the two of them had never actually needed the world's permission to begin with. Only the courage to stop asking for it. She looked at him then, the same steady, unreadable expression from all those months ago, finally giving way to something entirely open, entirely unguarded, and for the first time since either of them could remember, neither felt the need to measure their words before speaking them. What remained, in the end, was not a fairy tale free of complication, but something far more durable, a relationship built patiently on respect, tested publicly under pressure, and strengthened, rather than broken, by every attempt to tear it apart. Leon had spent 5 years believing love was a risk not worth taking. And Olivia had spent 3 years quietly proving him wrong without ever demanding he see it her way. Together, they had turned a single careless warning into the foundation of something neither the boardroom nor the tabloids could ever touch again. A partnership built not on power or position, but on the quiet, stubborn belief that two guarded people, given enough time and enough trust, could finally choose each other without fear.